Support for WUWM podcast comes from Hop Harvest and Vine and Good Harvest Market in Milwaukee, part of One Destination, combining farm-to-table dining, local craft beers, and organic groceries under one roof. More at goodharvestmarket.com.
You're listening to Lake Effect Spotlight from WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR station. This is one of our favorite conversations from WUWM's daily talk show, Lake Effect.
Life as an immigrant is commonly clouded by fear and uncertainty. The federal crackdown on immigration this past year has only increased those feelings for immigrants living in our area. Freelance writer Barbara Miner wanted to share the lived experiences of some Milwaukee immigrants, who make up about 12% of our city's population. Her article in this month's Milwaukee Magazine shares the stories of DACA recipients to undocumented parents, asylum seekers, and more. Miner joins me now to talk about the piece and begins by explaining some of the challenges she encountered covering the topic.
Trying to find people was the first difficulty. Convincing people to talk was the second. And the third was crossing my fingers and praying at night that the people I did interview would not bail before the article came out, because this was the fall. This was ice. And people were justifiably very, very afraid.
With good reason, there's hesitancy to speak to media when it comes to this. So some people are referred to maybe just their first names, however they want to be most comfortable. And I want to talk about some of the profiles, and we'll start with Santiago. He's been living in Milwaukee for almost 30 years, along with his wife, Isabella. And he shared with you that right now, more than ever, of all of his decades living here, the reality of everything he built, the risk of it disappearing, is kind of front and center for him right now. How has he been viewing this current climate?
Well, the irony of part of the immigration story is that you have many politicians who are pro-family. The family is everything. Well, here you have, in effect, immigration policies that literally tear apart families. Because Santiago and his wife, these are pseudonyms, do not have papers. They've lived here 30 years. Their 2 children are DACA recipients, which means they're kind of in limbo, to use a Catholic term. They're neither permanently legal nor in, risk of being imminently deported. And 2 grandchildren who were born in the United States who are citizens. So Santiago says, listen, they can't do much to me anymore. If I have to go back to Mexico, fine. I'm older, almost retired, sell our home. We have a little money, little savings. He said, but I would never see my children or grandchildren again. And that's the really just heartbreaking realities of a lot of these policies.
The piece highlights several core truths of the matter. This is a widely spanning, very complicated issue. We're not trying to oversimplify, but one big truth is that our system is flawed, right?
Flawed is probably one of the
nice
nicest,
way to put it, yeah.
Kafkaesque, sort of broken. One of the things that I found fascinating in researching the article is that the most comprehensive immigration reform around undocumented people was under Ronald Reagan. And Ronald Reagan actually supported immigration. And so Ronald Reagan, Mr. Republican, signed a bipartisan bill that gave amnesty to 3 million undocumented people. So to this day, in certain parts of the Latino community, Reagan is like their god. And so you have this Republican, pro-immigration, signed amnesty, Ronald Reagan, and then today, and it is just yet another indication of how that Republican Party has been transformed. And there is not going to be comprehensive immigration reform without bipartisan support.
Correct. And to kind of lean into the gray areas, you also wrote about Jorge Franco, and he's the head of the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce here in Wisconsin. And he leans into there's this truth, then there's this, there's this and this. So can you, while we're talking about the Republican Party and how that has either garnered support from the Hispanic community or not, Franco speaks on why there was an increased Hispanic vote for Trump in 2024. So can you share more kind of about the intricacies you were speaking with him?
Well, some of the intricacies were off the record, because one of the things that I found fascinating was I wanted to talk to some Latinos who voted for Trump. And I had some contacts and friends in the Latino community, and they said, yeah, sure, I'll find some. Yeah, I know someone. And they'd come back and say, my friend doesn't want to talk. He's embarrassed. He barely will look me in the eye to admit he voted for Trump. And what they say, a lot of the Latinos, voting is private, as it should be, but a lot had to do with the economy. And, people felt an economic pinch, and they thought Trump might make it better. So the whole issue of who supports what parts and why and how is extremely complicated, and for businesses too, because these businesses rely on immigrant labor.
Yeah, not only do businesses rely on immigrant labor, Franco also estimated that there are approximately more than 20,000 Hispanic-owned businesses in the entire state of Wisconsin.
Yes, this is one of the many things I realized in doing this article, how much I did not know. I'm college educated, postgraduate degrees. I consider myself a little bit informed. And every time I turned around, it seemed like there was some new fact I didn't realize. For example, you do not need a Social Security number to start a business. So you have very successful Latino Hispanic business people who may be undocumented.
So like we've been saying, this piece highlights several people to express their own truths in this complicated reality that they have to live in. And you talk to some dreamers, and I want to talk about Elena in particular. She grew up on the South Side where her neighborhood felt like family, but now she says, quote, I feel like we're losing that. Right now there's just a lot of fear, which is heartbreaking.
Very heartbreaking. And Elena is fascinating talking to her. She went to South Division, grew up on the South Side, went to Mount Mary. And she has a green card, which technically, and everything is technical and maybe an iffy right now, means she can, then apply for citizenship. Although in the last year, green cards have been revoked. And she knows that, and she's married to a U.S. citizen. She wants to have a family. She wants to get citizenship. She said, yeah, I used to speak out more, but not right now. I can't take the risk.
Well, in her family as well, her parents are both undocumented. And 4 years ago, they applied for U visas, which is a visa granted to crime victims for helping authorities. And this is a rough estimate, but estimates that it could take over 8 years for her parents to know whether or not they even get one.
And that's a lowball estimate.
Yeah.
I mean, that's one of the many things that I just was flabbergasted. For example, there's 185 different types of visas. You sometimes need a lawyer to know which one to even apply for. Lawyers are expensive. But let's say you're from Mexico and you want to apply for a visa to the United States, and you have sisters, brothers in the United States. So you apply for the sibling visa from Mexico. It's called F4. There's all these names and numbers. And there has not been an F4 visa issued to a Mexican since 2001, a quarter century ago. I mean, the system is irrevocable. Everyone knows it's broken. And as in so many other areas, Congress just has to get its act together and fix it. Well, they said, get in line. Yeah. There's no line to get into. Unless right now, if you're a white South Afrikaner, you can get in probably in a heartbeat. So you see the sort of racial and class biases that have always been part of the system, but they're just now out of control.
Well, on the note of the Afrikaners, one of many reasons someone may be staying in the U.S. is for asylum. And asylum applications and a lot of different type of visas, they have been decreased drastically under the current administration. And you share someone named Soraya's story, and she's only 28, but as you wrote, has already had a lifetime of experiences. Yeah. What's Soraya's background?
Well, she's Afghani, so that then and there, she's had a complicated life. Under the Taliban, then the Taliban wasn't in power, then the Taliban was back in power. And she comes from a minority population in Afghanistan, which right away kind of creates problems. She's a woman. She was educated at a university outside of Afghanistan, considered Western educated. And when it came time to think about going back to Afghanistan, her mom said, you do not have a future here. You're from a minority. You are educated in a Western university. You speak English. You're a woman. So she is probably the epitome of the term grit and pluck, because she just didn't give up. And she got a scholarship to attend UWM. And luckily, she graduated, it would be a year coming this May. She kind of got in under the wire of applying for asylum before Trump shut that down completely. So she applied for asylum last spring. When I interviewed her in the fall, she still did not even have an interview for when she could plead her case, let alone any clue whether she would be granted asylum.
And what are her hopes in the long run? I mean, she talked about how difficult it is to be away from her family, not even have the option to go see them again, and ultimately one day would love to return home, but who knows when that would be.
She misses her mother, I think, above all. And she has her hopes and her dreams, which would be the Taliban would be gone. She could return to Afghanistan. She could be with her family. But she also knows that that's probably not in the cards.
There was a lot of work and effort, I'm sure, that went into this. Do you want to share anything that didn't make it to the page, or, connections that didn't come through, or just things that stood out?
Maybe the tears as I tried. No, it was a very, very difficult article. It was interesting because I felt most concerned about Santiago and Isabella. They had the most to lose. And interestingly, I went with a good friend who's very fluent and bilingual. And he sat with me at the interview, and, I recorded it. And the Milwaukee Magazine, to its credit, does fact-checking. They wanted Santiago's phone number to call him. And I said, I can't. I'm sorry. Because once a phone number goes into an email and, Milwaukee Magazine's part of Quad Graphics, I said, I just can't take that chance. And we went back and forth a little bit, and Chris Drosner, the editor, whom I like quite a bit, he understood in the end.
What do you hope your piece can help do for Milwaukeeans, both for those who are living in this moment as immigrants and for people who perhaps haven't had any personal connections with others' lived experiences?
Well, I think right now, understandably, the focus is on ICE. You have to prevent people from being snatched up off the street. But the real question is, how do we get to immigration reform? And there has to be, I think, Jorge from the Chamber of Commerce, he said, it's sort of like two prize fighters in a ring, and after a certain point, they just get tired. True immigration reform, people are going to say, listen, we have to come together. We have to figure out a way for amnesty for people who've been here 20, 30, 40 years. Sure, you want to protect the borders, but what does that mean? Because there aren't people streaming over the border right now. The real concern is the people who've built lives here, who are part of our community. Children are American citizens, maybe the parents aren't. You don't want to rip apart families. You don't want to destroy industries. You want to build upon what you have. And that's going to take bipartisan congressional action.
And that starts with learning people's stories.
Because fundamentally, in the end, it's about the people.
Barbara Miner is a freelance writer for Milwaukee Magazine. You can find her recent article, On Shaky Ground, that shares local immigrant stories in this month's issue.
Want to hear more great stories about Milwaukee? Subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast. Lake Effect is a local show and podcast all about Milwaukee. Hear it on the radio at noon, Monday through Friday on 89.7 WUWM. And subscribe to the Lake Effect Spotlight podcast to hear some of the best content from the show.